Get off the bike, old man. You're a danger. The voice sliced through the quiet like a whip. It came from Officer Ava Michaels, 29, sharp-jawed, badge polished to a mirror shine. She wasn't asking. She was commanding. And the man she pointed at. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just sat there on his rusted 1970 Harley parked beside pump number 3 at a Shell station on Route 14 just north of El Paso, Texas. The July sun bore down merciless. The asphalt shimmered. A few people at nearby pumps slowed down. Phones lifted, cameras rolled. I said, "Get off the bike. Now." Her voice rose, cutting through the thick summer air. Beside her, Officer Trent Moore cracked his knuckles and stepped closer. The man, on the Harley Ellis Reed, 82 years old, didn't move, didn't protest. He kept his grip firm like roots clinging to time. "You could kill someone with your reaction time," Ava snapped. "You're not fit to drive, let alone ride this rust bucket." Then came the shove. Trent stepped forward and pushed the old man's shoulder hard. The Harley tipped slightly. Ellis's boot caught the ground in time, but not before the crowd gasped. A woman whispered, "Isn't he a veteran?" Another man replied, "Who cares? He's clearly senile." Ellis didn't answer. His face didn't change. His body didn't react. Only his eyes moved slow and deliberate, scanning the officers in front of him. They were young, armed, loud, and completely unaware of who they were talking to. The gas station owner, Marcus, froze behind the window. He knew Ellis. Everyone in town did. Quiet man. Lived alone out by the Red Mesa. Rode his Harley into town once a week for supplies, always stopped for the exact same pump. Never said much, but always paid in cash. Always looked people in the eye. Today was different. Today, the police were treating him like a threat. "You hearing me?" Ava's voice rang again. "Step off the bike, sir, or we'll have to consider this non-compliance." "You don't want to do that," Marcus muttered inside the booth. He was sweating now. He picked up the phone. Dialed. Back outside, Ava pulled her radio. Suspect is elderly male, non-responsive, possibly experiencing cognitive decline. Requesting transport for psychiatric evaluation. Ellis finally blinked. His lips parted just slightly, but no words came. "I don't think he can even talk," Trent chuckled. More laughter from behind the camera phones. The badge, the uniform, the tone, the law, all pointed at one conclusion: this man was broken, possibly dangerous, and needed to be handled. "You're not arresting him, are you?" a voice called from the crowd. "He's not safe," Ava shot back. "You want him riding down the highway crashing into a school bus." That's when Ellis moved. Not fast, not defiantly, just slowly. He reached into the leather pouch strapped to the side of his bike. The officers stepped back instantly, hands on their weapons. But Ellis only pulled out a folded cloth. Unwrapped it. A badge. Faded, scratched, but unmistakable United States Army Special Recon Command. Colonel. Nobody said a word. But Ava didn't back down. "That's not a license. That's not even relevant." "He's bluffing," Trent said. "Probably found it on eBay." Ellis looked at them both as if staring through their uniforms and into something smaller inside them. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low sandpaper on gravel. "I commanded men twice your size in places you've never dared to imagine." A chill swept over the crowd. A college kid whispered, "Wait, is that the colonel from Tikrit?" Another gasped, "No way. That's just a rumor." A mother clutched her son's shoulder tighter. Inside the booth, Marcus was still on the phone. His voice shook as he spoke. "Fort Buchanan. This is Marcus Reyes, Shell Station number 27. We've got a situation with Colonel Ellis Reed. He's being detained. It's serious. It's wrong. He needs backup." He paused. Then simply said, "I'm sending coordinates now." Back outside, the officers were now preparing to force Ellis from his bike. "Step off, or we'll have to restrain you," Ava barked again. Ellis didn't budge. And then the rumble. It started faint like distant thunder rolling over the horizon. Phones went up again, Heads turned. From the east, a cloud of dust rose over the highway. A sound like war drums filled the air. Then, 12 military Humvees painted in desert camo roared toward the station. They didn't slow. They didn't swerve. They surrounded the gas station in a tight circle, forming a perimeter. The crowd scattered in shock. Ava stumbled back. Trent reached for his gun, then hesitated. One of the Humvee's doors opened. A soldier stepped out, dress uniform, polished boots, hard jaw. He walked straight toward Ellis, stood at attention. "Saluted. Colonel Reed?" he said. "Sir, we came as fast as we could." Ellis nodded, but said nothing. The man turned to Ava. "Officer Michaels," he said, "I am Captain Terrence Holt, 4th Infantry. That man you just threatened to arrest trained every single man in my unit, including me. He's not a danger. He's the reason I'm alive." The silence was electric. Ava opened her mouth, closed it again. "Ma'am, Captain Holt added you owe this man your silence at the very least, and your respect if you can manage it." The crowd didn't cheer, didn't clap. They stood still, because for the first time they saw him, not just an old man on a Harley, but the kind of man who kept promises no matter how much time passed. The kind who stood up when the world looked away. The kind who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Before the scene could settle, a live streamer whispered, "They tried to drag a war hero off his bike, but the army came for him instead." Now, here's where I want to hear from you. If you saw an old veteran being treated this way, would you have stepped in? Comment why stand with the colonel if you believe respect should never retire. And don't miss what happens next because, trust me, they haven't learned their lesson yet. "You want a psych evaluation too," the officer sneered, taking a step toward the colonel as the dust from the 12 Humvees still hung heavy in the summer air. Captain Holt didn't blink. Already processing it, Ava Michaels replied coldly, folding her arms with practiced authority. Her voice was sharp, but strained. The crowd had shifted, now silent, now watching. The live streamer's camera trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. No one could have guessed what was coming next. Ellis Reed hadn't moved. Still seated on the worn leather of his Harley, still silent. The only movement was his breathing, slow, steady, as if none of this chaos belonged to him. "Captain Holt, step aside," Ava ordered, jaw tightening. "This is now a police matter." Holt took a single deliberate step closer to Ellis instead. "Officer, with all due respect, that man trained Delta teams in Baghdad. He walked out of Fallujah with 3 bullets in him and still got his squad back alive. He's not a suspect. He's a monument." The words hung like thunder. Across the street, Marcus, the station owner, opened the front door of the store holding an old photo, a newspaper clipping from 2007. A younger Ellis in uniform receiving a Medal of Valor from the Secretary of Defense. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. No one had seen that photo in years. Inside one of the Humvees, a soldier leaned over to another and whispered, "He once took a convoy through enemy fire for 17 hours straight. I read about it in training." The other just nodded, eyes still fixed on the colonel. But Ava wouldn't yield. "Enough of this theater," she snapped. "We're removing him for psychiatric evaluation." She turned to Trent. "Cuff him." What happened next was not what anyone expected. As Trent stepped forward with the cuffs, Ellis slowly took off his helmet. His silver hair, cropped tight, glinted in the sunlight. Then, without a word, he stood. No shaking, no weakness. 82 years old, and he stood like a mountain. And then he saluted. Not to the crowd, not to the officers, to the flag fluttering above the gas station. Silence. The kind that burns in the throat. And, suddenly a boy, the same boy who had been clinging to his mother earlier, stepped forward from the crowd. He couldn't be more than 10. He looked up at Ellis, took off his baseball cap, and placed it over his heart. "Is he really a colonel?" he asked softly. Ellis looked at him. "Yes, son." Another soldier exited a Humvee and walked over older late 50s with a limp. He carried something wrapped in a protective cloth. As he opened it, a quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. A folded American flag, battle-worn. with burn marks on one edge. "This was from Operation Iron Dagger," the man said. "Colonel Reed carried this out of a burning building in Kandahar. He wrapped it around a wounded private to stop the bleeding. Now, it wasn't just about rights or procedures, it was about honor, about memory, about a country that sometimes forgets the people who gave everything for it. But not today." And yet Ava wasn't done. "You are obstructing police operations," she said through clenched teeth. "You're all under review for interference. This isn't over." Trent raised his cuffs again, but this time a dozen soldiers stepped forward, forming a silent line between the colonel and the officers. One of them, a young Latina sergeant with 3 tours behind her, stepped in front of Ava. "With respect, ma'am, no one lays a hand on him unless it's with respect." Ava reached for her radio, ready to escalate, when suddenly the voice in her earpiece changed. Officer Michaels came the crackling voice from the other end. "This is Chief Garver. You're ordered to stand down, now." Her face froze. "You're being observed live from the governor's security office," the voice continued. "And unless you want to explain this to the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Pentagon, I suggest you disengage immediately." A moment of disbelief. Then, with a snap of her radio back to her belt, Ava turned to Trent and hissed, "We're done here. Let's go." As the 2 officers retreated toward their squad car, a soldier muttered under his breath, "She'll never live this down." The tension eased. Ellis sat back on his Harley, eyes fixed ahead like nothing had happened. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even stood up until he had to, and somehow that had moved mountains. Behind the scenes at Fort Buchanan, a secure line was being dialed. The voice on the other end simply said, "It's begun. He's still got it. And we need to make sure everyone remembers who he is. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Would you have stood between that veteran and those cuffs? Drop a comment. I salute the colonel if you believe honor still matters in this country. And don't forget, these stories are real and they're not finished. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens when a town has to answer for what it forgot. Because in the next chapter, the gas station won't be the only place called to answer. "Sir, may I speak to you privately?" "No, officer. That man trained my entire unit. He doesn't need privacy. He needs respect." Those words from Captain Holt struck harder than any siren. The ground still trembled from the arrival of 12 military Humvees now parked in formation around the Shell gas station. A desert wind carried the scent of sun-baked asphalt gasoline and something else, humiliation. Officer Ava Michaels stood frozen, her jaw clenched so tightly it might have cracked. Behind her, Officer Trent Moore looked like he wanted to disappear, but they weren't invisible. Not anymore. People had filmed everything. Live streams now exploded online with a headline that no PR team could spin. "Cops try to arrest decorated Colonel Military, shows up in 12. Humvees. And then came the silence. The kind that demanded something be said. Captain Holt turned to the crowd. "That man," he said, nodding at Ellis Reed, who now stood beside his Harley, "is the reason I'm alive today. In 2005, near Tikrit, our convoy got ambushed. I froze. He didn't. He carried 3 of us through live fire and still came back for the last one. He lost 2 ribs, and he never once mentioned it in all these years." Ellis didn't look proud. He looked away, like it was all happening to someone else, and maybe it was. Because in that moment, the people didn't just see a veteran. They saw a mirror, a reflection of what they feared they'd forgotten. Then Holt walked toward Officer Michaels. She tried to maintain her posture, but her voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't care who he was?" Holt replied. Behind them, a veteran stepped forward from the crowd, lean black suit Vietnam pin on his lapel. "We've been invisible so long," he said quietly. "They stopped checking if we were even real." Then it happened. A quiet ripple in the formation of soldiers. One by one, each of the 50 in uniform stepped forward in sync and took off their caps. They formed a line across the edge of the gas station lot. Then, all together, they saluted. Not a shout, not a chant. Just silence and reverence. Officer Michaels tried to speak, but the moment had overtaken her. The enormity of it. The weight of every name carved on a memorial she had never visited. She lowered her radio, and that's when the past hit her, because on her own phone, now buzzing in her pocket, were over 1,000 notifications. Her photo, her badge, her face now plastered across national veteran forums, and someone had already leaked her internal file. The one with the skipped cultural training modules, the flagged complaints, the red marks. Suddenly, she wasn't just the officer in charge, she was the face of disrespect. Back in the crowd, the little boy from earlier tugged his mother's hand again. Why did they yell at the colonel? The mother had no answer. And Ellis. He hadn't said another word. He picked up his helmet, placed it back on the handlebar, and began checking the straps as if preparing for just another ride home. But before he could mount the Harley, a long black SUV pulled up quietly behind the last Humvee. The passenger door opened. Out stepped a woman in a tan suit. She looked about 50, silver hair pulled tight. She wore no insignia, but her presence silenced even the soldiers. She walked up to Captain Holt and handed him a file, then turned to Ellis. "Colonel Reed," she said, "my name is Major General Amelia Grant. I am here on behalf of the Department of Defense. I've reviewed your service record. I've read every after-action report you signed. You should have been promoted twice. Instead, you retired early quietly after being passed over." Ellis met her eyes for the first time. "I didn't want to be promoted," he said. "I wanted to be useful." General Grant nodded. "Well, sir, you were. You still are." She turned to the officers. "I'll be taking jurisdiction over this incident," she said. "Effective immediately. Officer Michaels." "Officer Moore, you are relieved of your duties pending investigation under federal review." The gas station crowd stirred. Officer Michaels stepped forward. "Wait." This wasn't Federal General Grant cut her off. "When you assault a decorated colonel in public and initiate a psych evaluation without cause, it becomes federal, especially when you're standing on land purchased for strategic veteran reintegration outreach, which your department should have known had you read the boundary files. It was brutal, clinical, delivered like a final command. And now it was Ava who stood alone, surrounded by silence. The camera phones kept rolling. Ellis finally mounted the bike. But just before starting the engine, he looked over his shoulder at the crowd. "You don't fix what's broken by shouting," he said. "You fix it by remembering who held the line when others ran." And then the engine roared to life, a deep, steady growl that somehow echoed louder than the 12 Humvees behind him. He didn't peel away. He didn't make a show. He just rode, slowly, proudly. And as he disappeared into the orange evening dust, the crowd parted like a sea around memory. Now, I ask you, what would you have done if you were there? Type. He held the line in the comments if you believe the colonel deserved more than just silence. And subscribe now, because what happens next in this town will remind the whole country what dignity really looks like. They thought it was over. But Ellis had one more question to ask, and it was the one they couldn't answer. "We called you dangerous. You never even raised your voice." That line haunted every viewer who watched the video again and again. It echoed across forums, veteran networks, town halls, and homes where old war medals sat forgotten in drawers. Colonel Ellis Reed had said almost nothing, but his silence had roared louder than any outburst, any legal threat, any marching order. And 3 days later, that silence was still shaking the foundations of El Paso's police department. Inside the downtown precinct, Officer Ava Michaels sat stiffly in a dimly lit conference room. Her badge was on the table. Her uniform looked perfectly ironed but couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders. Across from her sat Chief Garver, arms folded, face unreadable. "We've received formal notice from the Department of Defense," Garver said. "You are now under federal review. I can't protect you. Not from this." Ava's voice cracked. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't care," the chief replied, "and now the whole country knows that." Meanwhile, across town, a different kind of silence filled the dry, sunlit air of Colonel Reed's ranch. Nestled on the edge of the red mesa, surrounded by nothing but prairie wind and stubborn cactus, it looked like a painting forgotten by time. Ellis sat on the porch in his usual wooden chair, slowly tightening a bolt on the leg with a pocket tool. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even bothered. He was thinking. Inside, a knock broke the quiet. Ellis stood and opened the door. It was her, Officer Ava Michaels. But she wasn't in uniform. She wore jeans and a navy blue shirt. No badge, no authority, only uncertainty. "I brought this," she said, holding up a thick binder. "It's the new training curriculum for law enforcement, the one General Grant approved. They want it taught in every department starting this fall." Ellis nodded. "Come in." She stepped inside cautiously. The house was simple. No trophies, no displays. Just a folded flag above the fireplace and a single photo on the mantel, a squad of young soldiers in desert camo, laughing under a burning sun. Ava noticed a coffee mug that read, "Retired, but never silent." Ellis poured 2 cups without asking. She took hers and sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he broke the silence. "Did you ever serve?" Ava shook her head. "No. My dad did. He died when I was little. I don't remember much." Ellis looked her in the eyes. Calm, unshaken. "Then how do you know who is dangerous?" She couldn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up kicking dust along the porch. Ava sipped her coffee. It tasted stronger than she expected. "I came to apologize," she said. "But not just for what I said. For never asking." Ellis stood and walked to the old gun cabinet. He didn't open it. He rested his hand on top of it like one might on the shoulder of an old friend. "Silence isn't weakness," he said. "It's choice. Sometimes it's the only thing left when words have lost their value." Just then, a car pulled up. It was Captain Holt. He stepped out and saluted from the driveway. "We've got company," Ellis said, standing to greet him. Holt wasn't alone. 3 more soldiers followed, one with a stack of folders, another carrying a small, sealed wooden box. "Colonel, we'd like to give you this," Holt said, placing the box on the table. "It's a commendation from the Joint Chiefs, your service records being formally reclassified. You're now listed as a Tier 1 historical figure in U.S. counterintelligence history." Ellis didn't smile. He only nodded. "We're also launching a program in your name," Holt continued. "It's called the Reed Protocol. Every new recruit, every officer will study what happened at that gas station and why." The box opened slowly. Inside, among the official medals and documents, was something simple. A single hand-carved plaque. "To the man who never shouted, but changed everything." Ava stared at it. Her eyes burned. Ellis said nothing. He simply picked up the plaque, turned it over once, then set it on the mantel beside the photo. "You still think silence is enough?" she asked quietly. Ellis turned to her. "Only when the noise isn't worth answering." That night, a story broke on national news, not about the incident, but about what followed. Ellis had refused all interviews, declined all honors. But he'd written a single letter published anonymously. It read, "If you see a veteran and your first instinct is fear, ask yourself what they fought to give you. Sometimes the ones who scare you most are the reason you're safe at all." The world responded. Veterans across the country stood taller. Civilians asked more questions. And for the first time in over a decade, Ellis's landline rang off the hook, not from the government, but from young people wanting to learn. And now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever misjudged someone just because they were quiet? Leave a comment I choose to ask first. And if you believe stories like this need to be told not for drama but for dignity, subscribe now and follow this journey. Because in the next part, the Colonel won't be speaking anymore. This time, it's the town's turn to answer. The Colonel rides again. That's what people whispered as they watched him glide down the red dirt road one last time. The sun had just begun to dip behind the mesa, casting long shadows over the quiet Texas town that would never forget what happened at the Shell gas station that week. Ellis Reed, 82 years old, didn't ask for parades. He didn't want speeches or ceremonies. But this town, after years of silence, finally understood what it meant to honor someone not with words, but with action. 3 weeks after the confrontation, something unexpected happened. A clip from that day, the one where Ellis said nothing as the officer shouted, had gone viral again. This time, not from outrage, but from reverence. A 10-year-old boy had posted his own message alongside the video. His name was Noah, the same boy who had removed his cap and asked, "Is he really a colonel?" In the video, Noah stood in front of his school wearing a hand-drawn name tag that said, "Honor Guard." He looked straight into the camera and said, "When I grow up, I want to be quiet like him, but brave." That single sentence hit harder than any headline. And the world listened. Soon, local schools started Read Days, moments of silence in classrooms where children would simply sit and reflect on what courage without noise looked like. One school created a wall of quiet heroes featuring photos of grandparents, uncles, and neighbors who had served. One picture stood at the center: Ellis Reed. But the biggest surprise came on a Thursday morning when the town of El Paso announced something no one expected. The Shell gas station was being purchased by the state and converted into a permanent memorial site. Not just for Ellis, but for every veteran who had ever been overlooked, misunderstood, or silenced. The sign above the station was replaced with a steel plaque: Reed Station, where silence speaks louder. Even Officer Ava Michaels returned. This time, not to enforce policy, but to stand before a crowd of veterans and citizens and read a letter. It began with 4 words. "I was completely wrong." Her voice cracked. She didn't hide her tears. "I saw an old man and assumed weakness. I thought silence meant confusion. I mistook stillness for danger. But now I know. Still waters run deep, and some of the loudest lessons come without a single word." She paused. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I promise I will never forget." That day, Ellis wasn't there. Because Ellis Reed, the man who once walked through Tikrit under fire, had quietly left town 2 nights before. No goodbyes, no attention. Only a note left on his porch. It read, "I've already said what I needed to say by not saying it." He left behind the plaque given by the Pentagon. He left behind the coffee mug. He took only his bike and one photograph, the same one that stood on his mantle. The one where his unit laughed under the desert sun, their arms around each other, dirt and sweat on their faces, but smiles so wide it hurt to look at them. He rode alone, but not for long. Because as he passed the final bend at the edge of town, something remarkable happened. Families stepped out of their homes and stood by the roadside. Children raised small flags. Elderly veterans, some in wheelchairs, lifted their hands in salute. And then, without any command, a young man in full military dress walked into the road, stood tall, and held up a sign. It said, "Thank you for not needing applause to be a hero." Ellis didn't stop. He just nodded once, a slight humble gesture, then disappeared into the dust. But the final image that people still talk about today isn't the engines. It isn't the crowd. It's what came next. Noah, the young boy, walked up to the Reed Station Memorial a week later with his father. He was holding something, a gift-wrapped box. Inside it, a hand-carved name tag. It read, "Ellis Reed's Quiet Army, age 10. He placed it under the plaque and saluted. So now I ask you, what kind of world would we have if we listened more to those who speak less? If you believe dignity can still change lives without shouting, write in the comments. Silence taught me more, and remember this. Some men fight wars. Others fight to be remembered. But the rarest ones fight without needing to be seen, and in doing so they become unforgettable. What will your silence say about you? Let that be the legacy. Let that be the question.